Chapter 6. Green and Pissed. For once, reality didn't live up to Romero's hype. The id guys arrived at the apartment in Madison on a gray day in September 1991 to find it considerably less fun than he and Tom had described. They were in a sprawling complex in which every building looked the same. Compared with their Shreveport house, it was a dump. No lake, no yard, no boat. When they walked down the hall, they didn't pass trees. They passed two scary-looking guys dealing drugs. At least they had some semblance of an id office, a 3-bedroom apartment in the complex. Because Carmack didn't care, he agreed to live in the upstairs bedroom while all the other guys got their own apartments elsewhere in the complex. Adrian, who was instantly miserable being out of his element, had even more problems because his apartment was on the far side of the development. While the other guys walked across the parking lot to get to the id office, Adrian had to drive. But Romero was delighted. He was starting fresh. He had a new girlfriend and new games. Tom shared in the enthusiasm, happy to be back home. Refreshed by the collegiate environment, the only real sore point for the two of them was Jason, who had become Carmack's friend. He seemed to be on a completely different wavelength. Still, Carmack wasn't ready to let him go. Despite their mixed feelings about their new situation, the id team buckled down to finish the second Commander Keen trilogy. After their long months working together, the team had formed into a collective personality. Romero and Carmack were now in a perfect groove, with Carmack improving the new Keen engine, the code that made the graphics, while Romero worked on the editor and tools, the software used to create the game elements. Nothing could distract them. One night, Beth and a few other women showed up at the apartment. The guys were hard at work. Beth did her best to attract Romero's attention. When nothing elicited a response, she threw up her hands and said, "Why can't we just have our men come home and have sex with us?" "Because we're working," Romero said. Carmack laughed. Tom was just as dedicated, feeling particularly giddy about their success of the project, which inspired him to new heights of creative design. He populated Keen's world with gun-toting potato men, tongue-wagging poisonous mushrooms, and his favorite, the dopefish, a green fish with big, dopey eyes and giant front teeth. Adrian, as usual, didn't share Tom's glee, but he put all his efforts into bringing the silly characters to life. His artwork was taking on more color and precision, rivaling that of the best games on the market. He was also finding a way to vent his mounting frustrations with Tom, Keen, and Madison. One time, he played around with the Commander Keen image, creating a graphic of Keen with his eyes gouged out and his throat ripped open. Adrian had a good laugh switching between the images of Keen all happy and chipper, and Keen sliced and diced. With the work on the new Keens progressing and checks continuing to pour in, Carmack was able to go back to his pet project, 3D first-person shooters. The latest step was inspired by something he had heard from Romero. Carmack and Romero had developed another aspect of the collaboration. Though Carmack was gifted at creating grain graphics, he had little interest in keeping up with the gaming world. He was never a player, really. He only made the games, just as he was the dungeon master, but not a player of D&D. Romero, by contrast, kept up with everything. All the new games and developers. It was through one of these developers that he first learned about the important new development called texture mapping. Texture mapping meant applying a detailed pattern or texture to a tile of graphics on the computer screen. Instead of drawing a solid color on the back wall of a game, the computer would draw a pattern of bricks. Romero heard about texture mapping from Paul Neurath, whose company Blue Sky Production was working on a game called Ultima Underworld, which would be published by Richard Garrett's Origin Company. Neurath told Romero that they were applying texture mapping to shapes or polygons in a 3-dimensional world. Cool, Romero thought. When he hung up the phone, he spun his chair to Carmack and said, "Paul said he's doing a game using texture mapping." "Texture mapping?" Carmack replied. then took a few seconds to spin the concept around in his head. I can do that. The result was Catacomb 3D, which incorporated texture-mapped walls of gray bricks covered in green slime. To play, the gamer ran through the maze, shooting fireballs out of a hand that was drawn in the lower center of the screen, as if one was looking down on one's own arm, reaching into the computer. By including the hand, id Software was making a subtle but strong point to the audience. You are not just playing the game, you're inhabiting it. The game ended up being published 6 months before Neurath's Ultima Underworld. Though Ultima Underworld, a role-playing adventure, received more attention because of Garrett's connection, together, the games took the 3D gaming experience to a new, more immersive place. When Scott Miller saw Catacomb 3D, he had one thing to say. We need to do something like this as shareware. As Thanksgiving 1991 neared, life in Madison was turning increasingly ugly. The drug-dealing neighbors had been arrested after the cops pounded down their door. Someone siphoned gasoline from their cars. Adrian was particularly miserable because he lost the cap to his waterbed and couldn't find a replacement. He spent months in a sleeping bag on the floor. Carmack had been sleeping on the floor for months too, though by choice. He simply didn't feel he needed a mattress. Finally, Romero got fed up with the situation and bought his partner a mattress, leaving it for him on his floor. "Dude," he said, "it's time you got a good night's sleep." Madison was growing cold. Really, really cold. Snow dumped from the sky. The entire parking lot of the complex was glazed over in ice. Every afternoon when he'd wake up, Adrian would have to sit in his car for 20 minutes, warming the engine so he could drive to the other side of the development. One time, they all went out to buy pizza, but ran back to their cars without the pie. They were so cold, they decided to leave the pizza and drive home. No one was willing to run back inside. The result was that they barely left their apartment. Though they were used to spending endless hours together in a small room, in Shreveport at least they had the opportunity to go outside and kneeboard around the lake. Here, they killed even more time playing Dungeons & Dragons. In an effort to expand the game, they even drew up flyers that they posted around town. At the top of the page, Adrian had drawn each of the id guys as their character in-game. Tom with a beard and a large axe, Romero with a huge sword, Adrian standing high with a belt that had the word "die" on a cloth, and Carmack, dressed as a wizard, holding the rulebook. Next to them was a blank stick figure with a question mark for a head. The flyer read, "Wanted, Cleric and/or Thief." Party playing in an awesome character and event-driven campaign. Just moved our business here. Need 1 or 2 new players. Things you will enjoy in this campaign. Character interaction. Good balance. Cool stuff happening. Pizza. Things you won't be doing in this campaign. Dominating the world. Tensions began to rise, however, about who was trying to dominate the apartment. Adrian was fed up with Tom and Romero bopping around, making alien noises, and imitating the characters from Keen. Even Carmack was growing tired of their antics. Worse was the trouble with Jason, who was becoming something of a fifth wheel. Carmack was still defending him, though, so instead of firing him, they assigned him to bang out a fast, easy game by himself that could fulfill an obligation on the softest contract. With the softest game being handled by Jason and the second Keen trilogy wrapping up, id could focus on its next project for Apogee. At this point, a hierarchy had been established. Carmack was the technology leader, coming up with the latest engines with which they could construct a game. Tom, as creative director, was in charge of spearheading the game stuff that would go around Carmack's technology. Romero fit nicely between the two, able to help Carmack with tools and at the same time goof around with Tom on creative ideas. Adrian would fulfill their orders for artwork, injecting when he could his own menacing visions. When the four sat down late one night to discuss a new game, those roles unexpectedly began to shift. The trouble started with Tom. Buoyed by the blockbuster success of the first trilogy months before, he had long imagined doing 3 trilogies, similar to the plan his hero, George Lucas, had mapped out for the Star Wars films. But Carmack's technology was clearly headed toward another idea, a fast-action first-person game. Keen was neither fast-action nor first-person. It was a side-scrolling adventure like Mario. It was implicit that the next game, at least, would call for something else. Tom was disappointed, but he shifted into high gear, brainstorming for the next first-person game. He had an immediate idea. "Hey," he said, "remember in the movie The Thing, when the guy comes out of the cage where the dogs are going insane from that first alien? And everyone asks him, 'What's in there?' And he says, 'I don't know, but it's weird and pissed off.' Well, that's just like a video game, because in the video games, you have no idea why you're shooting the monsters other than that they're green and pissed off. Why not do a game like that? Something about these mutant lab experiments you have to hunt down." He started jotting down potential titles at his PC as he read them aloud to the group. "Mutants from Hell. Die, mutants, die. 3 Demons. Texture Map Terrence and the Green Shits." Or he concluded they could just cut to the chase and call the game, "It's Green and Pissed." Everyone laughed. "Yeah," Romero said. "Imagine some game dude wandering into a computer store and saying to the clerk, excuse me, but do you have It's Green and Pissed?" Despite their approval, Tom quickly retreated from his idea. He didn't want to be controversial for controversy's sake. "Yeah, I don't know," Romero said. "That's so hackneyed. That's something you always hear of. It's like, yet again, the mutated lab full of bullshit, blah, blah, blah. We need to do something cool. You know, it'd be really fucking cool if we made a remake of Castle Wolfenstein and did it in 3D. Wolfenstein. It was a word that struck an immediate chord with both Carmack and Tom, who, like Romero and every other hardcore Apple II gamer, had grown up playing the classic action title created by the legendary Silas Warner in the early 1980s. They immediately got Romero's vision. Wolfenstein was perfect for Carmack's technology because it was, at its core, a maze-based shooter. The player had to run through all these labyrinths, fighting Nazis and collecting treasure, then doing away with Hitler. Despite the game's blocky, low-resolution graphics, it was unique in its implication of a larger virtual world. When Castle Wolfenstein was released, most games for computers or arcades, like Pong, existed on one static screen. But in Wolfenstein, the conceit was that each screen the player saw represented one large room of the castle. Each room was a maze of walls. When the player ran through the maze, the screen would change, showing a new room. Though there was no scrolling, the feeling was one of true exploration. Part of the appeal was that the player never knew what awaited in the next room. Often, it was a Nazi screaming in German. Encouraged by everyone's sympathetic reaction, Romero exploded with ideas. In the original Wolfenstein, the characters could search the bodies of dead soldiers. "How cool would that be to have in first-person 3D?" he said. "You could go through and, drag the bodies around the corner and rifle through their pockets. Prish, prish, prish," he said, imitating the sounds. "We have this opportunity to do something totally new here, something fast-paced, and something texture-mapped. If we can make the graphics look great and fast, and make the sound cool and loud, and make the game explosively fun, then we're going to have a winner, especially with the theme." The computer game industry was still meek, after all. SimCity, a hit game, challenged players to build and micromanage a virtual town. Civilization, another success, was a heady, risk-like strategy game based on famous historical battles, blood not included. Wolfenstein could be like nothing the industry had ever seen. It will just be shocking, Romero concluded. A totally shocking game. Carmack gave his blessing. Once behind an idea, Romero was always charismatically convincing. And Carmack was growing to appreciate Romero's talent for taking his technology into a new world. A place he himself would never have conceived. Adrian, who wasn't familiar with the original Wolfenstein, was eager to do anything other than keen, and the idea of 3D art intrigued him. Tom, though stung by the rejection of Keen, assumed that they would return to his games after this one. He was still the company's game designer, after all, so true to his conciliatory nature, he was willing to go along for the ride. It was a ride all the more immersive because of Carmack's technology, and all the more wild because for the first time in id's brief history, it was being steered by Romero. On a cold winter day, Carmack laced up his shoes, slipped on his jacket, and headed out into the Madison snow. The town was blanketed in the stuff, cars caked in frost, trees dangling ice. Carmack endured the chill because he had no car. He sold the MGB long before. It was easy enough for him to shut out the weather, just like he could, when necessary, shut Tom and Romero's antics out of his mind. He was on a mission. Carmack stepped into the local bank and requested a cashier's check for $11,000. The money was for a Next computer, the latest machine from Steve Jobs, co-creator of Apple. The Next, a stealth black cube, surpassed the promise of Jobs' earlier machines by incorporating Next Step, a powerful system tailor-made for custom software development. The market for PCs and games was exploding, and this was the perfect tool to create more dynamic titles. For the increasingly viable gaming platform, it was the ultimate Christmas present for the ultimate in-young graphics programmer. Carmack. The Next computer wasn't the only new spirit ushering in the new year. Times were changing in the world of id. They had finally fired Jason, narrowing the group to Carmack, Romero, Adrian, and Tom. But something else was in the air. The Reagan-Bush era was finally coming to a close, and a new spirit rising. It began in Seattle, where a sloppily dressed gung rock trio called Nirvana ousted Michael Jackson from the top of the pop charts with their new album, Nevermind. Soon, grunge and hip-hop were dominating the world with more brutal and honest views. Id was braced to do for games what those artists had done for music: overthrow the status quo. Games until this point had been ruled by their own equivalent of pop, in the form of Mario and Pac-Man. Unlike music, the software industry had never experienced anything as rebellious as Wolfenstein 3D. The title came after much brainstorming. At first, they assumed that they had to use something other than the Wolfenstein name, which had been created by Silas Warner at Muse Software. Tom banged out a list of options from the strained, the Fourth Reich, or Deep in Germany, to the absurd, Castle Hasselhoff, or Luger Me Now. He even played around with some German titles: Deutschteufel, Devil Dagger, Greutschglück, Bad Smell. To their surprise and relief, they discovered that Muse had gone bankrupt in the mid-1980s and let the trademark on the Wolfenstein name lapse. It would be Wolfenstein 3D. When they ran the idea by Scott, he loved it. He had been pleading with them to do a 3D shareware game for months. He too knew Castle Wolfenstein and cracked up at Romero's plan for their version. Loud guns, fast action, mowing down Nazis. Money was still rolling in from the Keen games. The second trilogy was out, and the shareware market too. Its numbers were disappointing. About a third of the original, but Scott knew this was not so much a sign of the game's appeal as verification of his original concern. That the retail release of Keen Game for FormGen would cut into his sales, because it left him with only 2 episodes, not 3. Nevertheless, the guys at id were his stars, and he believed wholeheartedly in their technology and vision. He guaranteed them $100,000 for Wolfenstein. id had no intentions to stop there. Mark Ryan, still id's probationary president, had scored with FormGen to release 2 more retail id products. id was excited but concerned. FormGen's first game with them, Commander Keen, Aliens Ate My Babysitter, didn't sell well. id blamed in part what they thought was a terrible box cover, designed by a company that had done packages for Lipton tea. But the prospect for another shot was enticing. Again, it would allow them to earn revenues from 2 lucrative markets, shareware and retail. No one, not even Origin and Sierra, was doing this. Though Mark and FormGen were reluctant to, as they said, stir up the World War II stuff, they agreed to take Wolfenstein retail. The id guys were growing accustomed to getting their way. Mitzi enjoyed her new perch atop Carmack's spacious black Next computer. She stretched out lazily on the monitor, letting her legs dangle over the screen. Surrounded by empty pizza boxes and Diet Coke cans, Romero, Carmack, Tom, and Adrian sat at their computers working on Wolfenstein 3D. The calmness of the outer world was in stark contrast to the world unfolding on the screens. Wolfenstein had taken on 2 imperatives. It would be brutal, as originally imagined by Romero, and it would be fast, as engineered by Carmack. Carmack knew he could keep up the speed, and thus the immersion, thanks to the leaps he had made by combining ray casting with texture mapping on Catacomb 3D. For Wolfenstein, he didn't so much as take another leap, as implore his existing code. Cleaning up the bugs, optimizing the speed, making it more elegant. A key decision was to let the graphics engine focus on drawing only what the player needed to see. That meant, once again, drawing the walls, but not the ceiling and floors. Also, to speed things up, characters and objects in the game would not be in true 3D. They would be sprites, flat images that, if encountered in real life, would look like cardboard cutouts. Romero, in pure Melvin mode, imagined all the crazy stuff they could do in a game where the object was, as he said, to mow down Nazis. He wanted to have the suspense of an Apple II game pumped up with the shock and horror of storming a Nazi bunker. There would be SS soldiers and Hitler. Adrian hit the history books, scanning images of the German leader to include throughout the game. But that wasn't enough. How about, Romero suggested, we throw in guard dogs, dogs that you can shoot, fucking German shepherds. Adrian cracked up, sketching out a dog that in a death animation could yelp back. And there should be blood, Romero said. Lots of blood. Blood like you've never seen in games. And the weapons should be lethal but simple. A knife, a pistol, maybe a Gatling gun too. Adrian sketched as Romero spoke. Tom came up with ideas for objects that player could collect throughout the game, and a paradigm dating back to the early text-based adventures. The gamer had 2 essential missions, to collect and to kill. Tom came up with treasures and crosses for players to find. There was also the issue of health items. A player would begin with his health at 100%. With every shot, the health would decrease until when it hit 0%, the player would die. To survive, a player could pick up so-called health items. Tom wanted these items to be funny. He said, "Why not turkey dinners?" Yeah. Even better, how about dog food? Agreed Romero. They were having German shepherds in the game, so what the hell? Tom began cackling at the thought of a player slurping up dog food. Or how about this? Tom added. When the player gets really low on health, at like 10%, he could run over the bloody guts of dead Nazi soldier and suck up those for extra energy. Romero said, making the sounds and whipping his chin while cracking up. It's like human giblets. You can eat up their gibs. The work would go late into the night. Carmack and Romero perfectly embodied the two extremes. While Carmack tweaked his code, Romero experimented with the graphics and new ways to exploit the tools. Carmack was building the guitar that Romero would bring to life. But their friendship was not traditional. They didn't discuss their lives, their hopes, their dreams. Sometimes, late at night, they would sit, side by side, playing a hovercraft racing game called F-Zero. For the most part, though, their friendship was in their work, their unbridled pursuit of the game. Carmack and Romero shared a vision that others didn't possess. Tom, deep down, was still closer to Keen, concerned about violence, about being too controversial, too bloody. Adrian liked the gore. He sketched out dead Nazis lying in pools of blood. But he still harbored a desire to get back to something more gothic and horrific, like Dangerous Dave in the Haunted Mansion. Carmack and Romero, however, were in sync. Carmack didn't so much care about the accoutrements of the game as he enjoyed Romero's passion for showing off what his engine could do. Romero got what he was doing, trying to make a sleek, simple, fast game engine. And he was the one who dreamed up the sleek, simple, fast game to go around it. Romero even began excising parts of the game just to adhere to that dictum. At first, they had programmed the game so that players could drag and search dead Nazis, as in the original Catacomb, Wolfenstein. But they didn't like the outcome. Ugh, Romero groaned as he watched Tom drag a body across the screen. That's not going to help the game be badass. It's slowing the game down. It's a neat idea, but when you're running down hallways and blowing down everything you see, who cares if you drag shit? We gotta rip that code right out of there. Anything that's going to stop us from mowing shit down, get rid of it. The brutality was not just a graphic and gameplay concern. It had to be matter of sound, too. It had developed a relationship with an out-of-the-town computer game musician named Bobby Prince. Bobby had worked with some apogee and come highly recommended by Scott Miller. He had done some work on the Keen games. For Wolfenstein, they needed him even more badly. The weapons had to sound suitably killer. To accomplish this, they would for the first time use digital sound. Bobby came up with a few suggestions, including a staccato rip for the machine gun. Late one afternoon, Romero got ready to play the sound effects for the first time. The game had really taken shape. On the suggestion of Scott Miller, Carmack had gone from the 16-color palette of EGA graphics to the new Video Graphics Adapter, or VGA, which allowed 256 colors. Adrian took full advantage of the expanded color range. He had drawn out soldiers with little helmets and boots. He created a special animation sequence that would show the soldiers twitching back in pain, blood splurting from their chests when they were shot. Romero loaded up the test portion of the game. He looked down the barrel of his chain gun as the Nazi approached him. He hit the fire button, and the roaring fire of the machine gun blast Bobby had programmed tore through the speakers as the Nazi went flying back. Romero flew back himself, hands off the keyboard, and fell to the floor laughing, holding his stomach. It was another moment, a variation on when he saw Dangerous Dave in copyright infringement for the first time. You know, he said, as his laughter finally subsided, there's never been another game like this. On the screen, the little Nazi bled. One afternoon in February 1992, Roberta Williams opened a package. She and her husband, Ken, were sitting in a gorgeous office in Northern California. atop one of the largest empires in the business, Sierra Online. They were among the leaders in the computer game industry, which had grown from 100 million per year in 1980 to nearly 1 billion. Their early graphical role-playing games had given way to a slew of titles, all created around Sierra's inherent philosophy: building brands by making game designers into celebrities. Sierra, as a result, received submissions for games all the time. This day, the contents of the package would catch Roberta's eye. There was a cover letter from a young programmer named John Romero. He had heard that she was becoming interested in children's games, and was including one he and his friends had made. It was doing rather well in the shareware market, he wrote. It was called Commander Keen in Goodbye Galaxy. Roberta and Ken were impressed and requested a meeting. The id guys were awestruck. They had grown up playing Sierra games. Now they were being asked to visit the king and queen in their lair. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Wolfenstein was coming into shape. If Sierra made them an offer they couldn't refuse, they might strike a deal. They decided to put together a short demo of the game to show the Williamses. When the id guys showed up at Sierra's offices, it was clear they hadn't left their apartments for a month. Romero had been growing out his hair. Tom had an unkempt beard. Carmack had holes in his shirt. They were all in ratty, torn jeans. Before they met with Ken and Roberta, they were given a tour of the offices. For the guys, particularly Romero and Tom, it was a tour of the Gamers Hall of Fame. Back in a seedy duplication room, they were introduced to Warren Schreiter. Romero and Tom looked at each other and immediately fell to their knees, bowing. "We're not worthy! We're not worthy!" they said. Schreiter, they knew, had designed one of their favorite old Apple II games, Threshold. "Dude," Romero beamed, "Threshold! You are the daddy!" But the allure soon wore off. Around the corner, Carmack fell into a conversation with a programmer. As Romero, Tom, and Adrian watched, Carmack chipped away at the programmer's work, challenging what to him was an obvious waste of time. When he was through, the Sierra programmer just sat there, completely belittled by Carmack's superior skills. Romero patted Carmack on the back as they walked away. "God, you just wiped him down." Carmack shrugged modestly. Romero was proud. The Williamses were not as impressed. The boys struck them as nothing more than highly talented and highly naive kids. When Ken Williams showed up at a fancy restaurant called Edna's Elderberry House with this ragtag group of guys in shabby clothes, he was pulled aside by their maitre d'. Williams had to explain that these were important guests before they were led to a private room with a long oak table and a burning fire. The food came and conversation flowed. Williams prided himself on discovering and nurturing young talent. But the inexperience of this group, he thought, was palpable. They didn't seem to have a business bone in their bodies. When they told Williams how much they were making on Commander Keen, he blanched. "You're telling me you're making $50,000 a month just from shareware?" They showed him the numbers. Scott had upped their royalty to 45%. There was virtually no overhead, they explained. Their shareware model let Apogee keep 95 cents for every dollar that came in. "We make the best stuff in shareware," Romero proclaimed. "That's why we're making so much money. If you think that's awesome," he said, "check this out." Tom took out a laptop, set it on the table, and urged Williams to hit the key. Wolfenstein came on the screen. Williams played the game with a poker face. The guys were dying with anticipation. Finally, Williams said, "Ah, that's neat." He closed the program. A final screen came up, with the face of Commander Keen and a green monster from Aliens ate my babysitter. In big words in the middle it said, id Software, part of the Sierra family? Do you mind removing the question mark? Williams said. Then he offered them $2.5 million. The id guys returned to their Snowden apartment to discuss the deal. $2.5 million was a lot of money for 4 or 5 guys to split. But they didn't jump the gun. They didn't want to just do a stock deal. They wanted some upfront cash. So they returned to the approach they'd originally taken with Scott Miller. Why don't we do this? Romero suggested. Let's ask for $100,000 down. If they're interested, then we'll sell. If they don't, then we don't do it. When presented with the request, Williams balked. Though he was impressed by their work, he wasn't ready to fork over such a large chunk of cash. The deal was over. Clearly, id thought he just didn't get what they were doing. He didn't understand the potential of Wolfenstein 3D. If he had, he would have immediately handed over the cash. It was a disappointment. Not so much because they missed out on money, but because their hero and his company had let them down. This game was going to change things, they knew. There was nothing on a computer like it. Fuck Sierra and their loser programmers, Romero told them. id would remain independent, and independently, they would rule. Fueled by the trip to Sierra, id's burgeoning egos exploded into their Dungeons & Dragons fantasies. Games, once again, had become the expressions of their own inner worlds. In recent rounds, Romero had been toying with the Democron, the darkly powerful book he had encouraged them to steal from the demons. It was a dangerous move, one that would either help them rule or destroy the world. Carmack grew increasingly distressed at Romero's recklessness. He didn't want to see the game he had spent so long creating get ruined. In a desperate move, he called Jay Wilbur back in Shreveport, asking him if he could fly up to Madison to reprise his D&D character and help stop Romero. But Jay couldn't make the trip. Ultimately, Carmack decided to test Romero's resolve, to just see how far his partner was willing to go. Late one night, Carmack, the dungeon master, brought the devil into play. He told Romero that a demonic creature in the game had a bargain to make. Give him the Democron, and he will grant you your greatest wishes. Romero said, if I'm going to give you this book, then I want some really kick-ass shit. Carmack assured him the demon would oblige with the Daikatana. Romero's eyes widened. The Daikatana was a mighty sword, one of the most powerful weapons in the game. Despite the pleas of the others, he told Carmack he wanted to give the demon the book. It didn't take long to find out the consequences. As the rules of the game dictated, Carmack rolled the die to randomly determine the strength of the demon's response. The demon was using the book to conjure more demons, he told the group. A battle of epic proportions ensued until Carmack declared the outcome. The material plane is overrun with demons. Everyone is dead. That's it. We're done. No one spoke. The guys couldn't believe it. After all those games, all the late nights around the table in Shreveport, the adventurers here that cured all the cold nights of Madison, it was over. A sadness filled the room. Romero finally said to Carmack, "Shit, that's fun playing that game. Now it's ruined. Is there any way to get it back?" But he knew the answer. Carmack was always true to himself and to his game. "No," he said. "It's over." There was a lesson to be learned. Romero had gone too far. With the D&D world destroyed, the Sierra deal blown, and Madison growing even colder, the id guys turned up the heat literally and figuratively. They needed help to get Wolfenstein done, they decided, and they knew just the person to call. Kevin Cloud. Kevin was the editorial director at Softdisk and had been acting as an informal liaison between id and their former home. Artistic, diligent, and well-organized, he seemed like the perfect complement to their team. Born in 1965 to a teacher and an electrician, Kevin grew up in Shreveport reading comics and playing in arcades. While pursuing a degree in political science, he took a job as a computer artist at Softdisk. It ended up changing his life. Kevin immediately struck up a friendship with the Gamer's Edge guys, emerging as one of their few allies during this rising mutiny. He spoke in a slow southern drawl and was partial to cowboy boots and blue jeans. He was polite and laid back, but he could also be darkly funny, enjoying scatological humor and riffing just as sickly as Romero and Tom. Unlike them, though, Kevin could tether it all on a dime, returning to a steady focus that their creative giddiness didn't seem to allow. After they left the company, Kevin distinguished himself for his diplomatic skills, able to keep Softdisk at bay, letting id maintain maximum freedom. The id guys called him from Wisconsin and said they'd like him to join their team. There was only one condition. He had to move to Madison. Kevin didn't hesitate. He was growing tired of Softdisk. He had just also gotten married and was ready to begin a new life. So he packed up all his belongings and hit the road with his wife for a 19-hour drive. He arrived early the next morning and knocked on id's apartment door. After a minute or so, Carmack appeared in his underwear, bleary-eyed, his hair matted. "Come back later," he said, and shut the door, leaving them standing with their bags in the cold. Kevin turned to his wife. Let's go get some coffee." Later, he came back and met with the guys. The deal was made. Kevin would join the team. Elated, he told them that he had already found an apartment and would sign the lease the following morning. Inspired, id decided it was time for them to move too. So Romero and Tom went out in search of spacious new digs. That night, they reported back to Carmack and Adrian. They had found a stylish new apartment complex, but Romero's bit, it seemed, had flipped. "Yeah, we can move across town, but I'm telling you, this fucking snow and ice, this shit sucks. I hate it here." "Yeah," Adrian said. "I really don't want to stay here anymore," Romero said. "I didn't know it'd be this bad in Wisconsin. Wouldn't it be cool to go to California? Mountains and trees. You know, that's what I like. A place where a human can be outside, around the year, and live, not die if he has nothing. I'm into that. It's like, okay, heat versus freezing, winter? I choose heat. I'd rather not have to bundle up, slide around, crack my skull open, and not be able to move my fingers. I'd rather be sweating my ass off in a fucking tank top out by the lake. We're a developer. We don't have to be in any one location. We can be anywhere." Wherever he went, he knew his girlfriend Beth would be happy to come along. As the midnight hour passed, they stretched a map across the table and discussed all the places they could move. "Jamaica," Tom suggested. Adrian spoke. "How about Dallas?" How about Dallas? It had a lot going for it. It was warm, in the south, and Apogee was there. Scott Miller, in fact, had long raved about the city, telling the guys how there was a huge lake, just like the one in Shreveport, where they could go skiing and maybe even get a house. Still better, Tom added, Texas had no state income tax, which meant they could make even more money. Dallas it would be. There was only one problem. Kevin Cloud. He was about to sign a lease for an apartment, which would commit id to staying in Madison for at least another 6 months. He had to be stopped. It was 3 a.m. In a panic, the id guys left a flurry of messages at Kevin's hotel. He woke up a few hours later and got the messages. "Don't sign the lease. Call immediately. We are the wind. We are the wind." "Oh my goodness," he said to his wife. "They must have looked at their budget and realized they can't hire me." He was relieved to hear the real news. Despite the long drive, he agreed to head with the guys down to Dallas, closer to home. "We are the wind," they repeated, as if it summed up everything about them. Their spontaneity, their speed, their elusiveness. A few weeks later, a moving truck backed up to their apartment. The guys waited as the driver went to open the back of the truck. The gate slid up. Their jaws dropped in disbelief. Sitting alone in the back of the truck, like a vision, like an omen, was a Pac-Man machine. Here it was. The game they had all grown up with. The one Romero had plastered with high scores all around Sacramento. The one they had copied in Shreveport in their Whack-Man demo. Romero gulped and asked the driver, "Is that your machine?" "It's mine now, I guess," the driver said. "Someone left it on my truck. They didn't want it in their house." The id guys looked at each other, nodding. "Hey, dude," Romero said. "Can we buy it from you?" The driver looked at these kids with long hair and torn jeans. They didn't look like they could afford a haircut, let alone a fancy arcade machine. "Sure," he said brashly. "For $150. Carmack reached into his pocket. "No problem," he said, peeling off the cash from a fat wad of bills. "Leave it on the truck." The game was coming to Texas.